Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are jumping straight into a really challenging but I think universal experience. It's that moment, that inflection point that every dedicated professional or any leader faces. The moment when the passion that got you started, that real fire, is just not enough anymore. What was once just pure zeal starts hitting the complexity of the real world. Ethical gray zones, incompetence, the sheer weight of your influence.
That is the core tension, isn't it? That's what our sources are really trying to dissect. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at that shift from, raw intensity to a more durable wisdom. We're looking at sources that argue a calling has to mature. It has to move from just passion-driven sacrifice to stewardship-shaped faithfulness.
Yeah.
And that brings up the big question, right? What if sincerity, no matter how intense it is not actually the same thing as faithfulness? Zeal is the fire, absolutely, but wisdom and stewardship, that's the structure you build to contain it for the long haul.
Okay, let's unpack that and to give you a bit of a roadmap for our conversation. First, we'll dig into the hidden problem, why that initial emotional fire so often fails down the line. Then we'll define what mature stewardship actually looks like and focus on safeguards, not constraints. And finally, we're going to spend a good bit of time on the three biggest tests of integrity, the inescapable ones: power, money, and cultural wisdom.
Right. So let's start at the beginning of that journey, what the sources are calling the inflection point.
Yeah.
Every great work, it starts with that emotional intensity, with zeal. It has to. It breaks through complacency. It demands sacrifice. It pulls you into action. And that spark, it should be celebrated. But, and this is a big but, the sources warn us pretty immediately about zeal without knowledge. It can be misdirected, even harmful.
But hold on, why does that initial fire fail? Isn't that devotion, that passion, the highest value? In this kind of mission-oriented work, we've often treated passion like it's the ultimate credential. We just assume that because the calling feels divine, our good intentions will somehow make up for, say, professional immaturity, that everything will just work itself out. Those sources seem to be saying that assumption is the real problem.
It is the foundational challenge. That assumption that sincerity is a substitute for competence and structure is exactly where the system breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the consequences of that unformed passion everywhere. For instance, when a leader experiences burnout, sheer exhaustion, it gets spiritualized, it's seen as a sign of their incredible devotion.
Mm.
But it's not examined for what it probably is: a failure of sustainable practices or delegation or just good organizational structure.
Right. Instead of seeing it as a management problem, it's seen as a badge of honor. And I've seen this play out where, because you don't examine that, the stakes get really high. Mm-hmm. Ethical failures like poor financial oversight get mislabeled as spiritual attacks.
Exactly, or misunderstandings.
Yeah, instead of what they are, which is the logical result of operating without any real accountability.
Precisely. The core issue is that calling is framed too narrowly. It's seen as just something to obey, not as something that you have to actively manage and mature and steward over time. And if you treat the calling as something you own because you feel it so deeply, you're going to struggle, really struggle, when external accountability comes knocking.
And this matters so much right now for you, our listener, whether you're leading a small team or a huge organization. The margin for error has just shrunk. Not because commitment is weaker, but because, as the sources say, impact is broader.
Mm-hmm.
A cultural misstep, an ethical blind spot, it can travel globally in minutes. And credibility, once you lose it, it is nearly impossible to get back. Passion without stewardship in this hyper-visible world isn't just inefficient. The sources argue it's actually dangerous.
Which leads us right to the solution, doesn't it? The shift to stewardship. We have to recognize that most ethical problems, they don't come from malice. They come from these unexamined assumptions about our own power, our resources, our position. Stewardship is the process that cleans up that gray area.
So how does it do that exactly? Because for a lot of people, the word stewardship just makes them think of, budgets or fundraising.
It's so much broader. It reframes the entire idea of calling. You move the conversation from ownership, my passion, my mission, to trust and accountability. A steward gets that everything they manage, time, money, influence people, it all belongs to something bigger than them. It means you're responsible not just for the great outcomes, but for the systems, the processes, the long-term health of everyone involved.
But doesn't that feel like it? I don't know, dampens the fire. If I'm suddenly focused on competence and ethics, am I just adding a bunch of secular constraints to a spiritual calling?
That's a natural fear. But stewardship introduces safeguards, not constraints. That's a key distinction. Our sources are clear on this. Mature stewardship sees these things that used to compete, well, now they converge. So first, Ethics become credibility safeguards. They protect you from your own blind spots and they protect the community from harm. Second, competence is seen as responsible preparation. It's not some secular intrusion, it honors the task. If the mission is divine, shouldn't the execution be excellent? And third, character is cultivated, not just assumed because you have zeal, it's forged in the quiet moments under pressure.
I really like that idea of convergence. So emotional maturity and strategic thinking and spiritual discernment, they stop fighting each other and they start reinforcing each other.
Absolutely, and you need that structural thinking for endurance. Passion gets you started, it gives you trajectory, but it won't sustain you. Mature calling is faithfulness over time. It's sustained through what the sources call the hidden years and uncelebrated obedience. That's where the real durability is made. I mean, think about Moses, right? He had zeal, but he spent decades tending sheep. That wasn't a delay, that was formation.
That long haul perspective is so critical. So let's dive into the three inescapable realities that really test that sincerity. The sources are, they're really insistent here. Wherever resources flow, power follows. And when power follows, ethical responsibility gets way more intense.
Let's start with power. It's often the quietest test. And
Ah.
power, in this context, is just the ability to impact other people. Ethics are the safeguards you need to keep that power from becoming corrosive. Without those clear structures, passion becomes a force multiplier for good or for harm. And an unethical system with a zealous leader, well, that's a disaster.
I see the danger. If a leader has all this zeal but zero accountability, their sincerity can actually be used to advance their own agenda, and they might not even see the harm they're doing. So what does the stewardship model demand?
The sources point to the Jesus model, which just completely reframed leadership. It's not about having good intentions, it's about structure. Power is not a tool to advance yourself, it's a responsibility to empower others. So ethical stewardship demands that power is used in service. To elevate others, to delegate, to protect the vulnerable. You have to constantly ask, am I expanding the capacity of my team, or am I just reinforcing my own position at the center?
That's a great metric. Okay, let's move to the second test, which is often the one that gets all the attention: money.
Right. And it's often seen as just a tool, but the sources say it's three things at once: a tool, a test, and a temptation. And stewarding it isn't just bookkeeping, it is a spiritual discipline. This means leaders need radical transparency, clear accountability, and a commitment to making sure funds build up local capacity, not create dependency.
I think the most powerful insight here is that failure so often comes not from a lack of money, but from how it's managed. We've all seen examples where, well-intentioned foreign funding actually creates dependency. They build a great facility, but they don't train or fund local people to sustain it. It erodes local agency.
And that's the temptation side. The temptation isn't always to steal. Often it's the temptation to maintain control through the money. True stewardship demands transparency so your mission and your management are aligned. If your mission is empowerment, your budget has to show that.
Which leads us directly to the third test: cultural responsibility. You can have the best intentions, the most honest budget, but without cultural wisdom, you can do so much harm.
So much. Good intentions do not translate into cultural wisdom. Stewardship demands humility, the absolute necessity to listen before you act and to learn before you lead. It means recognizing that our way of doing things, our cultural packaging, is not the same as the underlying message itself.
And the source material is really strong on this. It argues that cultural respect should be treated as a theological obligation, not just a logistical courtesy. If we ignore local wisdom, we risk confusing the gospel with, our own foreign culture. It creates paternalism.
Precisely. Paternalism is the opposite of stewardship. Stewardship respects the wisdom that's already there.
Mhm.
It asks, are we building something that will flourish locally on its own? Or does it collapse the second we leave? If our zeal makes us rush in and override local customs or leaders, we've picked our passion over real faithfulness.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground, from the initial fire to all these friction points. To bring it all together, the sources introduce a practical tool: the MQ framework, mission quotient.
Yeah, the MQ framework it's brilliant in its simplicity. Its whole purpose is to keep faith from fragmenting. It makes sure that all the elements of a calling, the spiritual, the ethical, the practical, are all measured together holistically. It makes that abstract intensity into something you can actually measure and sustain.
So let's break down those three dimensions for you, our listener, because this is where it gets really practical for your own work. First is character. This is the foundation. Zeal has to be anchored in humility, in moral consistency. You have to ask, what are my blind spots? Does my public self match my private self?
Right. Second is competence. This honors the task. As we said, spiritual sincerity is no excuse for negligence. I mean, look at the craftsmen building the tabernacle in the Bible. They were filled with the Spirit not just to worship, but to execute with skill. If God's calling demanded excellence in carpentry, why would it demand any less in modern leadership or finance? Stewardship means you develop the skills you need for your impact.
And then finally, strategic wisdom. This is about discernment. It's learning to think long-term to balance that immediate emotional action with disciplined discernment. It's the difference between just reacting to every crisis versus proactively building resilient systems.
We see this in the sources. Jesus withdrawing for prayer, Paul knowing when to advance and when to wait. Strategic wisdom ensures your effort is actually pointed at the long-term goal. And when you integrate all three, character, competence, and strategic wisdom, the calling becomes sustainable. That raw intensity is transformed into what the sources call enduring light, steady, trustworthy, and life-giving.
And that is the journey.
Hmm.
From zeal to stewardship. We've tracked how that initial fire needs the structures of ethics, competence, and humility to protect its own credibility and ensure it can last.
So as you think about your own work, your own vocation, maybe reflect on this difficult truth our sources raise. The most serious threats to mission today, they often don't come from external resistance. They come from internal immaturity, the failure to mature our own zeal into wisdom. But conversely, the greatest opportunities emerge when the work is done not just faster or louder, but with greater care, deeper wisdom, and a sustained, accountable commitment over time.
So this week, think about your own enthusiasm. Where is your fire strong, but maybe your structure is weak? How are you pairing that powerful driving zeal with the critical structures of discernment and competence that you need for long-term faithfulness? Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.